Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. As part of a big news today, we'll be discussing a very interesting topic which is related to cheetahs and ivory. It's a very interesting story which has been developing since October and it has now manifested itself in the CITES conference. Before we go into what we have to discuss for today, as always we are available on Telegram. So do use the QR code given here or the link in the description below to join us on Telegram. With this, we have a very interesting case of cheetahs for ivory. And before we go into the nitty-gritty, I would like to give you a very basic summary of the whole topic. India received cheetahs from Namibia, and under that arrangement there was a very interesting agreement which happened between Namibia and India, that for these cheetahs, when Namibia is going to push a resolution in CITES with regards to legalization of ivory trade, India would abstain or vote in favor of that basic agreement. And India has done the same with regards to what has happened just recently. So when we talk about cheetahs and what we call as soft power and the concept of diplomacy through animals, this is a very interesting case. So the first batch of cheetahs was received in India on 17th September from Namibia, and they are in the Kuno National Park in Madhya Pradesh. But under that agreement which happened in July, the two countries committed to promoting, under quotes, sustainable utilization and management of biodiversity by supporting each other at international forums, specifically CITES. We'll discuss what is CITES actually. But the interesting arrangement in this concept was that India is going to get the cheetahs, and when it will come to ivory trade, India is either going to abstain or is going to vote in favor of legalization of ivory trade. There's a whole lobby of countries in Africa which want that, and we'll try to understand the larger picture here. So when we look at the interesting ivory story, we understand one thing, that India for the past 3 decades has been very clear. Ivory, which is the tusk of an elephant, is something which should be illegal and should not be allowed in trade itself. Therefore, international ivory trade should be banned. And the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wildlife, Fauna and Flora, which is CITES itself, is a very important international agreement between the member states and regional economic organizations, which is technically voluntary. So the CITES is a very important convention with regards to import and export of flora and fauna, but it's a voluntary organization. Now, when it comes to CITES, there are Appendix 1, 2 and 3. Now, to ensure that international trade in wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival itself, the CITES makes sure that there is a certain type of regulatory mechanism within international trade. So what we're trying to understand till this point is, what has been India's stance? India's stance has been very clear: no ivory trade. And this stance has been there in the CITES convention, which is technically international trade in endangered species, and it is to make sure that we don't have trade which is leading to extinction. Now, ivory is globally banned since 1989, when all African elephant population were put into CITES Appendix 1. Thereafter, the population of Botswana and Zimbabwe were transferred to Appendix 2 in 1997 and South Africa in 2000. And no trade is allowed under CITES Appendix 1, and the trade is strictly regulated under Appendix 2. So let's try to understand what are these appendix. Appendix 1 lists the species which are most endangered and there can be no trade in them. So if a species is in this appendix, there cannot be any trade internationally in that species. Appendix 2 is a list of species that are not necessarily now threatened with extinction but may get if there is no controlled trade itself. Appendix 3 is a list of species which can be included on the request of a party that already regulates trade in the species and that needs cooperation from other countries with regards to illegal exploitation. So this Appendix 1, no trade; Appendix 2, restricted trade; and Appendix 3 is when a country wants other countries to cooperate. So when it comes to ivory, India has been very clear, and CITES is a very important convention. So what is the larger story here? So in 1999 and 2008, Namibia along with Zimbabwe, Botswana and South Africa were allowed under CITES to conduct a one-off sale of the ivory stockpile, which was there because of the natural death of elephants and the seizures from the poachers. Now what happens is that because of these 2 years, there was a major spike because poaching increased because 1 year trade was allowed. But Namibia and the other South African countries are arguing that our elephant population has bounced back and there's a major stockpile of ivory which is there. And if it will be not sold internationally, it will be a problem for the state itself. And if we can sell it, we would get the much needed money and revenue for elephant conservation and incentivizing community. So basically they're saying that we'll sell this ivory to help elephant conservation. Subsequently, Namibia did push a proposal for allowing regular controlled form of trade in ivory by delisting the elephant population of the 4 countries under CITES Appendix 2, but that got rejected in the Conference of Parties to CITES in 2016-2019. Both times India was against this proposal, and the opposition to this proposal is that if there will be a controlled trade itself, it will lead to sharp spikes in elephant poaching, which happened in 1999 and 2008 itself. So the interesting part of the story is that because we wanted to restore cheetahs in India, for the first time India did not vote against a proposal seeking to reopen ivory trade. So basically, cheetahs for ivory is the larger concept here, which is that the proposal which had been pushed by Namibia, Botswana, South Africa and Zimbabwe, though it got defeated generally because of a larger opposition to this concept, 83 to 15, but India for the first time didn't take a stance. And what is even more interesting is that when an Indian proposal came through for sustainable commercial use of a North Indian rosewood, it was defeated and Namibia actually voted against it. So before we end this session, you need to contextualize everything. See, first we've understood CITES. What is CITES? It's a very important organization, voluntary organization with regards to trade in flora and fauna. And we have Appendix 1, 2 and 3. 1, no trade. 2, restricted trade. 3, if the other countries want cooperation. But what is even more interesting in this story is that India has been very clear. No ivory trade, no trading in elephant tusks. And in 1999-2008, there were 2 exceptions made under Appendix 2, which is to sell off whatever stockpile was there. Now, Namibia since then has been pushing for a regulated, controlled, CITES-based trade in ivory, but no country wants that because it in turn leads to spike in poaching. Now, cheetah has become an interesting part of the story because when Namibia did agree to give India cheetahs, there was a concept that India would need to either change its stance or abstain from voting in CITES, and this is what India has done. Now this is diplomacy via animals or a larger concept of environmental diplomacy, but it's a very interesting case of how now countries are moving beyond a traditional sphere of international relations, and this is a very good case of how environmental protection, politics, trade and the larger interest of countries can come together in that regard. So I hope that you understand the importance of this story in your preparation, which is to understand soft power, to understand animal-based diplomacy, to understand how India is strategically moving away from its older stance to get something out of the other countries, which is the concept of having a fluid form of diplomacy, not having very strong ideals in that regard when it comes to our own interest, which is good. With this, I would like to end the session. Thank you so much for your patience. I will see you in the next video. Take care. Bye bye.